Okay, in this section we're going to start to take a look at the unhappy path. All of the time so far on this course we've been looking at the happy path, and we've only been concerned of requests that we think are going to work. We haven't dealt with any kind of validation, nor have we dealt with error handling, and all of that's going to change in this particular section. Now, the way I like to set up error handling is I really like to configure it centrally and make it easy to use when it comes to coding our application. And we're going to follow that philosophy on both the server and on the client as well. Now, inside Postman, where I'm at the moment, inside Module 10, we'll start with creating an activity and what we're doing in terms of validation. And in terms of validation, well, we're not doing anything at all. And if I attempt to send up a request to post to our activities endpoint, which is the create activity endpoint, then let's see what happens right now. And if I click on send, then we can see that we get a status 200 OK response, and we're not sending back the activity when we do create one anyway. So this looks like it's worked successfully. And if we go back to Module 4, and let's make a request to go and get the activities and click on send, and we scroll down to the bottom here, what we'll find is that we've created effectively a blank activity. The only thing that has been created for us is the GUID, because the server is capable of creating a GUID on its own. But all of the other fields are effectively blank, and this is a consequence of not validating our request to the API. So we need to do this, and this is what we're going to start with. And I'll show a couple of different ways of doing this. And one thing that we can do, if we go to our domain and go to our activity entity, what we could use to validate our requests is data annotations. And I'm just going to experiment with the title property here. And what we could say is that we want our title to be required. And we specify a required data annotation. And if we use the quick fix, we can get the using system component model data annotations. And now the title property is effectively required. Now we don't need to do anything else. If I go back to Postman and I try and repeat this request to go and create a blank activity, so let's find that request, and I click on send. Now this time we're not allowed to create the activity. We get a 400 bad request, and it tells us that we've got some errors and the title field, and it says the title field is required. Aha! Well, a lot of magic has happened here in the background. And the magic that we're referring to is inside our API controllers, because we haven't done anything in addition to simply adding this required data annotation. If we take a look at our controllers and we go back to the base API controller, we have an API controller attribute here. And this is doing some magic when it comes to validation. When we add a data annotation in this way, then our API controller is going to generate automatic HTTP 400 responses if it encounters a validation error. And if we just go and take a look at the documentation for the API controller attribute in the Microsoft docs, then we've got here the automatic HTTP4 responses. So what this replaces is, if we didn't use the API controller, then we would have to check the model state and see if this is valid. Anytime that a request doesn't meet the validation requirements, it adds an entry into the model state object. And if it's got an error in there, then it's going to be marked as not valid, and then we could return a bad request with the model state. Now all of this is happening automatically because we're using the API controller attribute, so we don't need to do anything in addition to this. And we get our 400 response. So this is fine, and it can work in simple scenarios, but do we really want to be adding data annotations to our domain entities? Do we want this kind of logic in our entities, for example? Does it make sense for it to be here? And I'm going to say no. I think that we should do our validation in our application layer and not in the domain layer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the required attribute here, and we're going to approach this in a different way, and I'll also clean up the using statement there. So we know that we can validate our entities, but I want to look at a different way. And in the next lesson, we're going to take a look at something called fluent validation.